stand here on this riverbank 3,300 years ago. The air smells of wet mud, incense, and roasting duck fat drifting from 100 cook fires. Somewhere behind you, a whip cracks against stone, and 10,000 voices groan in unison as a block the size of a house inches up a ramp of packed sand. This is not a ruin. This is not a museum. This is Egypt at noon, at its absolute height, when a single man was worshipped as a living god, and the entire world sent tribute to his door. Before the sand buried it, before the empires forgot it, before it became postcards and puzzle books. This was the most powerful nation on earth, and you are standing right in the middle of it. Forget everything you think you know about ancient Egypt. To the Egyptians who lived here, at the peak of their civilization, the pyramids were already old. Older than Rome is to us today. Older than the idea of Rome even existing. We are stepping into a specific moment, a golden window somewhere between the reign of the great pyramid builders and the twilight of the New Kingdom, when Egypt stretched from the marshes of the Nile Delta down past the Fourth Cataract, when Egyptian gold funded the palaces of foreign kings just to keep them friendly, and when the word Pharaoh made merchants in Babylon lower their voices. This is a walk through that world, street level, ground level, skin on stone level. We will smell the spice markets of Thebes. We will feel the heat radiate off limestone that has just been quarried. We will watch a funeral procession vanish into the western desert, and a war fleet return up the Nile dragging chained prisoners behind it. And by the end, we will understand something the Egyptians understood better than almost any civilization before or since. That empires do not just build monuments to survive. They build monuments, so death itself has to ask permission first. Everything here begins with water, and water here behaves like nowhere else on the planet. Once a year, the Nile rises. Not gently, it floods, turning a thin green ribbon of farmland into a shallow brown sea that stretches for miles on either bank. To a farmer standing ankle-deep in that flood, this looks like catastrophe. To the Egyptian state, it looks like clockwork, because this flood is predictable, measurable, almost sacred in its regularity, and whoever can predict it, control it, and organize an entire population around it holds something no neighboring kingdom has: certainty. Priests stand at stone nilometers, cut into riverbanks, reading water levels the way a modern banker reads a market ticker. Too low, and famine creeps toward the villages before winter even arrives. Too high, and mud brick homes dissolve like sugar in a doorway. Just right, and the black silt left behind turns the entire valley into the richest farmland in the ancient world. Enough grain surplus to feed soldiers who never touch a plow, craftsmen who never grow a single vegetable, and a court of scribes, priests, and nobles who spend their entire lives never once getting their hands dirty. This surplus is the real foundation under every pyramid, every temple pylon, every gold death mask you have ever seen in a museum case. Not magic. Logistics. And at the center of that logistics network sits one man, wearing the double crown of a unified kingdom, whose job title translates roughly to Great House. Pharaoh. Not just a king. A hinge between mortal Egypt and the gods who supposedly keep that river flooding on schedule. Fail to keep the gods happy, the thinking goes, and the Nile stops rising. So the Pharaoh does not just rule Egypt. He is Egypt's insurance policy against chaos itself. Push south, past the Delta, past Memphis, and the Nile carries you into Thebes, the beating religious heart of the empire at its height. The heat here does not simply exist. It presses against you, thick enough to taste, shimmering off the limestone causeways that lead toward the Karnak temple complex. Karnak is not one building. It is a city inside a city, added onto by pharaoh after pharaoh for 2,000 years, each ruler determined to outshine the one before, until the main hall alone holds columns so massive that 10 grown men linking arms could not circle one at its base. Inside those columns, sunlight barely reaches the floor. Priests move through shafts of gold-tinted dust, chanting hymns that only they and the god are permitted to hear. Outside, the city sprawls in a completely different register. Narrow mud brick streets twist between 2- and 3-story homes. Laundry and drying fish hung from upper windows. Children chasing a hoop past a donkey cart loaded with pottery jars sealed in wax. A woman haggles over a bundle of onions. A scribe sits cross-legged in the shade, papyrus across his lap, recording a grain tax dispute between 2 farmers who cannot read a single hieroglyph themselves. Smoke curls from a bakery stall where flatbread bakes on hot stones, next to a beer cellar ladling a thick, nutritious brew that ordinary Egyptians drink daily, workers included, right alongside their bread ration. This is not a silent, solemn world of stone gods and mummies. It is loud. It is alive. It smells like river mud, roasting fish, and temple incense all fighting for the same air. And every single person in this street, from the barefoot child to the wealthiest merchant, understands they exist inside a machine built to serve one purpose: keeping Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe, from tipping over into chaos. Follow the funeral processions west, across the river, and the entire tone of the world changes. The East Bank belongs to the living. The West Bank, where the sun sinks and dies each evening, belongs to the dead. Here, in the Valley of the Kings, teams of skilled workers, not slaves as later myth would claim, but paid, organized laborers living in a purpose-built village, spend years carving tombs directly into the cliff face. These are not simple graves. They are entire underground worlds, corridor after corridor sloping deep into rock, covered floor to ceiling in painted scenes meant to guide a pharaoh's spirit safely through 12 hours of nighttime danger before rebirth at dawn. Picture the funeral itself. A boat, dragged on sledges across the desert, carries a gilded coffin toward the tomb entrance. Professional mourners wail and tear at their hair, their grief performed as loudly and visibly as possible, because silence at a funeral like this would insult the gods themselves. Priests wearing jackal masks representing Anubis perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching ceremonial tools to the mummy's face, believed to restore sight, breath, and speech in the next world. And then the tomb seals shut, entombing gold death masks, chariots, furniture, jars of wine, even boats, everything a king could need for eternity. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. Every single object buried in that darkness, every painted wall meant to be seen by no living eyes ever again, was built with the same obsessive craftsmanship as anything on public display in the temples above ground. Because the audience was never the public. The audience was the gods, and eternity itself. Now travel south, past the first cataract, into Nubia, and the mood shifts again, from sacred stillness to raw imperial power. Egyptian fortresses line the river here, garrison towns bristling with archers, built to control the gold mines and trade routes that fund the entire kingdom. Convoys move north, loaded with Nubian gold, ebony, ivory, exotic animal skins, and something the temple reliefs record with brutal honesty: chained prisoners, destined for labor or for public display back in Thebes. Egypt's northern border tells a different story. Here, diplomacy replaces raw conquest. Clay tablets exchanged between the Egyptian court and foreign kings in Babylon, Mitanni, and Hatti reveal something surprising. Egypt is so wealthy and so feared that rival kings write letters practically begging for Egyptian gold, sometimes phrased less like equals and more like anxious neighbors hoping not to be noticed. But peace here is never guaranteed. At Kadesh, thousands of chariots collide in one of the largest chariot battles in recorded history. Dust and bronze and screaming horses filling a river valley far from the Nile, fought over trade routes and buffer states that decide, in Egyptian eyes, whether the entire eastern frontier holds or collapses. This is the paradox sitting underneath every gold death mask and painted temple wall. The peace, the splendor, the towering monuments you picture when you hear the word Egypt, all of it rests on soldiers, garrisons, and a very deliberate reputation for violence projected far beyond the Nile itself. No empire holds this shape forever, and Egypt is no exception, even at its absolute peak. Watch closely enough, and the warning signs are already there, hidden inside the same records that celebrate Egyptian glory. Tomb worker strikes, the very craftsmen building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, walking off the job because grain payments arrive late, an almost unthinkable act of defiance against the state that claims to speak for the gods. Grain prices, quietly recorded on broken pottery shards, creeping upward during years when the Nile flood arrives weak or fails outright. Foreign mercenaries, once useful hired muscle, gradually becoming powerful enough to make their own demands. None of this looks like collapse yet. It looks like small cracks in enormous stone, easy to ignore when the temples are still rising and the tribute still arrives. But every civilization that ever mistook its peak for permanence has learned the same lesson eventually. The gods, it turns out, were never the ones keeping the river predictable. Walk back now, across the river, past Karnak's silent columns, past the sealed tombs, past the fortress towns and the chariot battlefields. All of it, the gold, the funerals, the empire, the fear, existed for one reason: to convince an entire civilization, generation after generation, that order could be permanent if enough stone was piled high enough and enough gold was buried deep enough. It could not be. Nothing ever is. Floods failed. Dynasties fell. Foreign armies eventually did cross those borders. The temples fell silent, the priesthoods faded, and the language carved into every wall became unreadable for over 1,000 years, until a single stone, found near a town called Rosetta, finally handed the key back to the modern world. And yet, despite invasion, drought, civil war, and the slow erosion of 3,000 years, the pyramids are still standing on the horizon outside Cairo today, visible from apartment windows and highway overpasses, utterly indifferent to everything that has happened since. The Egypt you just walked through is gone. But somehow, impossibly, it never quite left. If this journey through the peak of the pharaohs pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed, because the Hidden Empire has a lot more of these walks planned. And tell us in the comments, which lost city or empire should we walk through next?